Christopher Hitchens is a columnist for Vanity Fair and The Nation. His latest book is titled Unacknowledged Legislation, Writers in the Public Sphere. In it, he describes the relationship between literature and politics. Next, he talks about writers who have entered the arena of political debate and takes questions from the audience. It's a little under an hour and 10 minutes.
Hello. Christopher Hitchens really should be introduced by someone far wittier, far more erudite than I. So even I can't match him for trenchant sarcasm, so I'm just going to give you some facts about Christopher Hitchens. First of all, the man writes a lot. His recent book about Bill and Hillary Clinton, No One Left to Lie For, The Values of the Worst Family, clearly created quite a stir. Among his other books, and this is an incomplete list, are two collections of essays, as well as Hostage to History, Cyprus from the Ottomans to Kissinger, Imperial Spoils, The Case of the Parthenon Marbles, Blood, Class, and Nostalgia, Anglo-American Ironies, and The Missionary Position, Mother Teresa in Theory and Practice. Which of his books has not created quite a stir? Our Oxford-educated speaker, born in Portsmouth, England, consistently flattens hypocrisy, rarely flatters. And just today, The Trial of Henry Kissinger is out, a book in which he argues that Kissinger committed war crimes, notably in allowing bombing of Laos well beyond the purposes of war and merely for political purposes. And with his next book, he will return to that tradition so dear to the hearts of academics, the double title separated by a colon with, On the Contrary, colon, Letters to a Young Radical. By the way, if you check out Christopher Hitchens' website, you will find not only Hitchens' memorabilia for sale, but also a list of people he considers artists, comrades, and mentors. This is a list that includes many people, among them Tom Tomorrow, one of my favorite political cartoonists, Susan Sontag, Albert Camus, Mark Twain, George Eliot, Karl Marx. He also thanks and appreciates Tom Paine, a political essayist to whom Christopher Hitchens himself could easily be compared. I also noticed in the book that he will be discussing primarily tonight, he has an appreciation of Gore Vidal as the cosmopolitan man. And in discussing Vidal, he enjoys the image of a Congressman Vidal or a Senator Vidal, his blade flashing from its scabbard. And I thought, Senator Hitchens, his blade flashing. And sure enough, Gore Vidal nominated Christopher Hitchens as his own successor, his own Dauphin. Anyway, Christopher Hitchens is very visible. He writes columns for Vanity Fair and since 1982 for The Nation. We've seen him on Larry King Live, Hardball, Meet the Press. He would have participated in an online chat to discuss these accusations against Kissinger had not the sponsor, Encyclopedia Britannica, under somewhat suspicious circumstances, not canceled that event at the last minute. In any case, before I turn over the podium, I'd like to thank some of the sponsors of tonight's lecture, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Journalism and Media Studies, the Center for Critical Analysis of Contemporary Culture, the Department of English, and the Department of History. And now, to discuss unacknowledged legislation, writers in the public sphere, is The Nation's writer in the public sphere, Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you so much. You didn't stay for an embrace, but I left the podium by another way. That's very handsome indeed. I especially like the bit about being visible. My intention, though, is more to be palpable, where it could be, but visible will do until palpable can materialize itself. Because the attempt to make oneself felt, as it used to be said, is probably the highest calling of the cosmopolitan gentleman, a title I hadn't heard before tonight, but to which I now suddenly am filled with aspiration. It's very nice of you, ladies and gentlemen, all to come on such a beautiful English spring evening, the sort that makes me miss the plague-infested meadows of my youth, and to attend to what I want to discuss, which is the intersection of the literary calling and the public responsibility, which I'll do in this manner. And then I'll be your prisoner, your hostage, I promise, until the last dog dies, as was once said by a president I hoped to drive into an early retirement. Writing in response to Thomas Love Peacock, who had said that a poet in our time is a semi-barbarian in a civilized community, Percy Bysshe Shelley proclaimed in 1821, and I'm quoting now, that poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, the fate of Shelley's polemic, entitled In Defense of Poetry, which is usually pared down until it's just those last phrases I've quoted, or sometimes only the last one, isn't untypical of the fate of radical freelance work in all ages. The magazine to which Shelley sent it, and which had printed Peacock's original scornful remarks, ceased to publish almost as soon as the riposte from Shelley had been composed. Shelley then hoped to publish it in the pages of The Liberal, a periodical that was launched by Byron and by Leigh Hunt. But The Liberal, too, expired in the grand tradition of noble-minded and penurious reviews. I speak from bitter experience. Shelley died long before that essay saw print, and his widow, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, got it into publication only 18 years after his decease, omitting several of the references to Peacock. Thus, we can say that we owe our much too easy familiarity with one attenuated remark by Shelley to the belated efforts of the author of Frankenstein, who was also the daughter of the authors of Political Justice, that was Daddy, and A Vindication of the Rights of Women, that was Mama. But Frankenstein's unhappy invention or creation allows me an easy transition to the following, which was written by W.H. Auden in August 1968. Auden was very fond of numinous dates as the title, or titles of his poems, or for the titling of poetry. The 1st of September 1939 is considered by some people to be his finest work. This was simply called August 1968, and it goes, the ogre does what ogres can, deeds quite impossible for man, but one prize is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. About the subjugated plain, amid the vanquished and the slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. And August 1968, as some of you will be old enough to remember, was the date of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, of the Red Army crushing of the Czech experiment. And it was penned by Auden as a very immediate response, hot immediate response, from just across the Austrian frontier to that erasure by the Soviet Union of culture and democracy in Czechoslovakia. I happened that month to be in Havana in Cuba and was on my way to Prague, and I was very much struck, without registering it, of course, anything like so acutely or memorably, but very much struck by the awful rhetoric and the terminology employed by the defenders of that invasion by the Warsaw Pact, some of whom were in the West. There's a term in French, langue du bois, the wooden tongue, which was coined by nobody knows who to describe particularly thuggish and inept phrases of propaganda. And langue du bois, the wooden tongue, seems to be the perfect appellation still for the name that the occupation regime in Prague and its sponsors eventually gave to the government they installed. They called it a regime of normalization. If you will pause for a second and consider the horror of living under a regime of normalization, you'll, I think, see the distance between that and poetry. And 21 years later, only 21 years later, the mighty occupation authority that had been installed by the full weight of that, I'm sorry to revert again to a foreign tag, but Ernst Fischer, the great Austrian Marxist critic, referred to it as Panzerkommunismus, Panzer communism. The full weight of Panzer communism that had imposed this regime in Prague collapsed, completely collapsed, amid laughter and ignominy, and collapsed without the loss of a single life or the breaking of a single limb as a consequence of a civil opposition that was led by satirical playwrights, ironic essayists, bohemian jazz players, I mean bohemian in both senses here, Moravian jazz players too, and rock musicians, and subversive poets, and that was all it took. Now, life in the Czech lands and also the Slovak lands has perhaps since become much more banal. You might want to say more prosaic. But would it be, I'm reverting to Shelley now, would it be merely romantic to say that Auden, in 1968, had been somehow aware of the gigantic shadows that futurity casts upon the present, moved not, or not so much as moving? He had prefigured the end of a system which depended essentially on gibberish and propaganda and upon lying. Now the sword, as we have reason to know, and it's an old cliché, is often very much mightier than the pen. I invert the cliché for these purposes. In a real fight, you'd rather have a sword than a pen. However, there are things that pens can do and that swords definitely cannot. And every tank, even every tank, as Bertolt Brecht once remarks, has a crucial flaw in its design. Its driver is the crucial flaw in that design. And suppose we imagine that that driver has recently read something good, or has a decent song, or a good poem in his head. Imagine that and everything becomes imaginable, and not just romantically. I was invited recently by the Los Angeles Times to contribute to what I think of as one of those symposia on politics and the novel. People write in, they do their stuff, they pick their hits and favorites and so on. And I was asked to name the works of fiction that had most influence on me. You've read these things, they come around every year. Novels were specified, works of fiction were specified. But even so, I ought really to have said the war poems of Wilfred Owen. Now, these poems are neither novels, and nor in one important sense are they fictional or imaginary. But I'll never be able to forget the way in which these verses by Owen from 1916 completely turned over all the furniture of my mind and inverted every concept of order and patriotism and tradition on which I'd been brought up. And I'd never then heard of, let alone read, the novels of Eric Maria Remarque, you remember All Quiet on the Western Front, or Henri Barbusse, or the paintings of Otto Dix, or even the works of Rosa Luxemburg. And of course the great trilogy, the great novelistic trilogy, recent winner of the Booker Prize, Regeneration by Pat Barker, to which I can't recommend you enough, had not yet been written. But it was through the door that was forced open for me by Owen's Dulce et decorum est. It is sweet and seemly to die for your country, pro patria mori. It was through the door forced open for me by those incredible verses that I found all these treasures. And so it's very satisfying for me to find and to read again his poem. It's called A Terre, in the earth or beneath the earth, being the philosophy of many soldiers, and to come across the following lines. Certainly flowers have the easiest time on earth. I shall be one with nature, herb and stone, Shelley would tell me. Shelley would be stunned. The dullest Tommy hugs that fancy now. Pushing up daisies is their creed, you know. That's a really fine and true appreciation of Shelley, to find a dry and ironic use for him for the idea of humans manuring the ground in death, and to find it in the very trench warfare and the commonplaces uttered by soldiers of 1914, 1916, 1918. Most of Owen's poetry was finished, completed would be a better word, in the 12 months before his life was thrown away by his commanders in a futile action on the Sombre Meuse Canal. And he only published 4 poems in his lifetime, only 4 in print, aiming for the readers of the Old Nation magazine and the Athenaeum, and spending, which always gratifies me when I think about it, part of his last leave, part of his last few days on earth, with Oscar Wilde's friend and executor Robert Ross, and with Scott Moncrief, a translator of remembrance of things past. In fact, Wilfred Owen, hailed as a soldier's poet and a poet of heroism and the front line and manliness. It took a long time for us to decode the poems and the letters, but comes to us now as one of the ancestors of gay writing in the 20th century. But much more than that, he's conclusively outlived all of the jingoistic versifiers, all of the blood-spattered liberal politicians, all of the garlanded generals and the other supposed legislators of his period, of his time. And he's the most powerful single rebuttal, I think, of Auden's mild and sane claim that poetry makes nothing happen. Now, another way that I would want to state my own ambition, apart from attending to rhythms like those set on by Auden and Owen, and to see how long those rhythms are and how well they continue to resonate and how sound they are when you touch them in our own time, is to look for those who try to raise prose to the level of poetry. Some of you may remember Monsieur Jourdain, a character in Molière's play La Malade Imaginaire, the hypochondriac. Monsieur Jourdain is astonished to find late in the play that, quite unknown to himself, he's been speaking prose all his life. He's quite gratified by the discovery. Another more blunt way of stating what I'm hoping for in looking for prose that rises to the level of poetry, because we're all of us capable of prose, and indeed I'm speaking it now, would range from P.G. Wodehouse, especially, I would say, The Code of the Worcesters, his masterpiece of 1936, to Oscar Wilde, to Anthony Pole's ear for secret harmonies and unheard melodies. Another more practical way of stating my own secret ambition it's not secret now I've told you, but has been a secret ambition of mine, would be to recall George Orwell's desire to, well, stated hope that he could make political writing into an art. Now, the intersection where this occurs, the intersection where politics, prose, poetry, and art and public life occur, is an occasion of paradox still, and of epigram, and of aphorism. We still pay attention when Oscar Wilde says that socialism, if it was properly considered, would free us from the distress and from the tedium of living for others. We lend an ear when Orwell, who was so stupidly called a saint by Sir Victor Pritchard, the last thing he wanted to be, announces that saints must always be judged guilty until they're proven innocent. Lionel Trilling once alluded to the bloody crossroads where literature and politics meet, and this phrase was annexed by the dire Norman Podhoretz, who in my opinion is to Trilling as a satyr to Hyperion, for the title of a notorious and propagandistic and very langue de bois book. But, properly understood and appreciated, literature need never collide with, or merely collide with, or recoil from, the agora, the public square. It need not be, as Stendhal has it in Le Rouge et le Noir. By the way, Al Gore said on, of all places, the Oprah Winfrey show, that this was his favorite novel. A novel in which Stendhal says that politics is a stone tied to the neck of literature, and that politics in the novel is a pistol shot in the middle of a concert. Well, let's admit that the openly, directly, crudely politicized writer, literateur, is something we've learned to distrust, or someone we've learned to distrust. Really now, who remembers Mikhail Sholokhov and Quiet Flows the Don and the epics of socialist realist fiction of the 30s and 40s and 50s? I suspect that these have died and will not be revived. We also have learned to distrust, or we should have learned to distrust, the surreptitiously politicized novelist, the one who imports a hidden agenda without courage, without fiber, into his confected narrative. I would give the instance of Tom Wolfe for contemporary readers as the great warning of that. Gabriel Garcia Marquez has paid a very high price for his temporary political allegiances, and so I think have his readers, if they've followed him that far. But in the work of Tolstoy, of Dickens, of Nabokov, and even of Proust, we find that they're occupied with the political condition as naturally as if they were breathing. The proper study of mankind, in other words, is man, which I think is what Auden must also have intended to say when he wrote in obeisance to a man, well, in valediction also to a man, in obsequy to a man whose public opinions he actively distrusted. That's William Butler Yeats. Auden regarded Yeats as a dangerous man, as a potential fascist, nationalist, an unstable and volatile and possibly hateful influence on public life, but he adored him as a poet and wrote, in memory of W.B. Yeats, in February of 1939, another one of his productions in that very ominous year, time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent and indifferent in a week to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives. Time which, with this strange excuse, pardons Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardon him for writing well. He goes on to say, if I have it right, no, he goes on to say that nothing is lost, in effect, from these verses in contemplation of the fact that Auden removed them, cut them out, along with many other exquisite poems of his, from his own canon, in what I think is a boring attempt to re-establish himself as a man of Anglican Christian integrity. Also, I think he overestimated the time it will take to rehabilitate Paul Claudel. But when he says that cowardice and conceit are pardoned and that the trophies will be laid at the feet of those who worship language, he means it seriously and he means it timelessly. And he abolishes the idea of the merely political or partisan difference in the meanwhile. Now, I'm afraid that most of the subjects who I've mentioned, most of the individuals I've mentioned, the authors I've mentioned, are English or American or Anglo-American, and I don't know whether I should apologize for that or not. I can't, in fact, apologize for it, because for one thing, I am mainly English, and I don't have any real competence in any other tongue. For another, I feel more confident in saying this, the Anglo-American idiom, our language, is well on the way to being what Kipling and others always hoped that it would be, though not in the guise they hoped it would be, namely a world language, and a world language that is not an imperial language. And you might add, at least in some ways, a world language to the extent that it's ceased to be an imperial language, the kind that Kipling hoped would be carried to the furthest ends of the earth by proselytization. And the written record of English literature is also a very powerful and flexible instrument for the understanding of British and perhaps post-British society. While in the United States, the role of the writer is given an exceptional salience by a single fact, that the United States is, and it's unique in this way, a written country, a country founded upon documents, measurable, readable, legible texts, subject to continuous revision and interpretation. That it is, in other words, as a country, as a constitution, as a proclamation, a work in progress. There is no other country that can make this claim, and those who live here, I often think, don't realize how lucky they are to be taking part in this grand revision of the founding documents and the work in progress. There is no clause in that great constitution that mandates, for example, an opposition party. Indeed, the whole document's designed to evolve consensus, and does so, in my opinion, much too successfully. But the First Amendment, which places freedom of expression on a level with freedom of and freedom from religion, grants the writer very wide powers. I've been doing a graduate class on the subject of unacknowledged legislation in my department at the Graduate Center in the New School in New York. In fact, it was this class that gave me the title for this book. And I tried to show to the graduates who were kind enough to show up how often it is in the history of the United States that when all parties in the state and all forces and potentates within the state are agreed, are of one mind on a given matter, it's the individual pen which creates the moral space for a true argument. In other words, which substitutes for the opposition party for which the Constitution is so conspicuous. Some of the chief instances would be Thomas Paine on the whole issue of independence. Thomas Paine, who, since I'm standing where I'm standing, who bore arms with honor in the region of Trenton, New Jersey, on the issue of independence, and also on the issue of republicanism, of an anti-monarchical independence. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass on slavery. Mark Twain and William Dean Howells on imperialism, on the expansionist urge. And Upton Sinclair and John Steinbeck on the exploitation of labor. Nearer to our own time, there was the disruption by Norman Mailer and Robert Lowell of the unspoken agreement that crossed all party lines on a war of atrocity and aggression in Indochina. And of course, we have Gore Vidal's 7-volume novelization of American history, the only literary attempt we have at the creation of what he terms a usable past. This is a country where writers enjoy great privilege, in other words, and upon whom a great responsibility is laid, and upon whom well, perhaps once in a generation that responsibility is discharged. Now, although it's been borne around the globe largely on the shoulders of a homogenizing American commerce, which is a disadvantage in some people's minds, another way in which English has become a language of universals is the form in which it's been annexed, appropriated by its former colonial subjects, those, in other words, who learned it because they were conquered by Englishmen. And here the crucial figure, in my opinion, is Salman Rushdie. Ever since he wrote his magnificent evocation of the combination of partition and parturition in Midnight's Children, he's been raising a body of work which is, while it's deeply based in the love and the study of classical English letters, where he has an affection and what can I call it, an acquaintanceship that's second to none, truly deserves the name of being cosmopolitan. I will, in fact, break off here to tell you an anecdote. I noticed the other day that Robert Ludlum had died. Perhaps you too mourned it when you saw it in the New York Times, which printed, as well as his obituary, the long list of his publications. And I was present once at a discussion where Salman Rushdie was also present, where someone was denouncing Robert Ludlum, not just for being a bad writer, that would have been, shall we say, otiose or supererogatory or surplus to requirements, but as a man who had boring and bad and pretentious titles for his novels, such as the Scarlatti Inheritance, I think was one, the Eiger Sanction, the Bourne Convention, a tremendous freight of pomposity piled upon this pulp. And Mr. Rushdie was attending hardly at all to this discussion until somebody said, well, what if a Shakespeare play was to be titled by Robert Ludlum, at which point he leant over. And it was asked of someone with no more preparation than I'm giving you, well, all right, what would Ludlum have called Hamlet? And Mr. Rushdie said, the Elsinore Vacillation. So I said to him, look, Buster, you can't, I bet you, that's great, but you can't do that twice. What about Macbeth? The Dunsinane Deforestation. In no more time than it takes to tell, the kerchief implication, the Rialto sanction. It occurs to me now, as I'm telling you this, and it certainly very vividly occurred to me then, that no one can try and rework magically or post-colonially, or in any other fashion, the English canon. No one's going to be able to do that who doesn't know it and love it already. It is not to be reworked by those who think of it as a textual wilderness. And it's just as well to have a nodding acquaintance with the stuff before you embark upon updates. But that, by the way, no, not by the way, I wish I could have done that myself. I still do. I hope you do too. Anyway, his experiments with language and with dialect and his conscription of musical themes, he's almost managed to get music onto the page. He's approached the closest in my lifetime among my cohort, perhaps I could dare say, to poetry in prose. And he's also, and in an inescapable way, the way he tried to evade and would have wished to evade, has become a political writer for an emerging multinational, and perhaps I shouldn't need to emphasize this, secular readership. A horrible discovery that some of us have had to make in the last few years is the way in which the diverse has become uniform. The multi-ethnic has become yet another excuse for sensitivity. That the more plural everything has become, the more singular it has become, that there are clusters of orthodoxies that are enforced as if they were single ones. And one of the instances of this, of multiculturalism and obeisance to it, multi-ethnicity and obeisance to it, a supposed complement to pluralism, could be enforced as an orthodoxy or as a uniformity, came in 1989, just as the ogre, Auden's ogre of 68, was about to collapse My friend Mr. Rushdie was criminally assaulted by a simultaneous death sentence and life sentence, a fatwa issued by a moribund theocrat. And the intervening 10 years, in which the forces of mercenary assassination and religious coercion and theological bullying were met and could only be opposed by the forces of wit and reason and irony, involved a campaign which I'm very proud to have had a small part in. And as I'm writing this to you, or reading this to you, saying this to you as he's writing still, it's the discredited mullahs in Tehran who have to answer to a host of independent voices in their own country and critical literary voices in their own press. And I think nothing could be more satisfying than that outcome. The summa, in my opinion, of the published record on this argument was published originally in French. You can get, with difficulty, an English translation now. It's called Pour Rushdie, for Rushdie. And it's an anthology in which almost every writer worth reading in the Arab world and the Farsi-speaking world, the Persian world, the wider Muslim world, takes Rushdie's side and identifies his crisis with the Satanic Verses, with their own hopes for the emancipation of their own societies. In other words, we were present, though many people were too grudging to realize it, at a very important catalytic moment with that battle. And that volume was the finest possible repudiation of all the Western conservative elements and some of the hanging back liberal and supposedly multi-ethnic ones too, who claimed to see merit in the Ayatollah's condemnation of blasphemy, or who claimed to find it all a question of sensitivity, and asked the bleating question, well, is nothing sacred? A question to which there can be only one answer. I'll state the question again. Is nothing sacred? Of course not. Now, aptly enough, perhaps, the very best defense in print of Rushdie as a profane and revolutionary writer in the great tradition of Joyce and Rabelais was actually written by Milan Kundera, who was and remains the literary eminence of the Czech cultural resistance of 1968. And you can find that brilliant essay in his own book, Testaments Betrayed. Marx is supposed to have said that one Balzac is worth 100 Zolas. And as an admirer of Zola, I partly resent and partly respect this judgment. Many of the writers I've been mentioning have had no agenda of any kind, haven't set out to be reformers or crusaders or pamphleteers. And many of my favorites are conservatives, culturally or in a literary sense, whose insights and integrity are indispensable. I can remember, for example, sitting with Jorge Luis Borges in Argentina, in his apartment in Buenos Aires, in 1977 it was, which shows my age, as he was employing an almost Evelyn Waugh kind of argument in excusing the military dictatorship that then held power in his country. A government, I remember he said, a government of gentlemen, even if they're military gentlemen, is better than a government of pimps. He had nothing but distaste for the populism of democracy, seemed to prefer a dictatorship of the generals and the uniform, and seemed to enjoy teasing his visitors with these Evelyn Waugh type aperçus. But I had the feeling, even as he was doing it, that he couldn't quite keep up this pose and that it concealed a certain unease. And not many years later, I was delighted to see that he wrote a satirical poem ridiculing the war in the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas Islands, if you're an Argentine, the Falklands-Malvinas Islands, the Thatcher-Argentine War, in which he described the quarrel between Britain and Argentina over the islands as like watching two bald men fighting over a comb, whilst also making quite strong statements against the junta's cruelty that he lets allow him this, that he probably had just discovered in the matter of the people who had, it's a very powerful word, I think, in Spanish, desaparecido, the disappeared, those who, in the most terrifying thing that can happen under a dictatorship, had simply vanished, had dematerialized. And he wrote about it very well. I thought it wasn't just another author signing just another petition about just another human rights problem, because that you can get any day of the week if you read the New York Review of Books. I thought it was something much more important. It was the ironic mind refusing the dictates of the literal mind and finding the limit of dignity beyond which it could not be pushed. And Borges, too, don't forget, hugely assisted the evolution of English as a global idiom, as a global vernacular, and very much promoted it as such in his own native country and continent as well as beyond. If there's to be a Balzac in this instance, my own would be George Eliot. I spent a good deal of the 1990s attempting to understand the role that's played by lying and corruption and demagogy in American democracy, in the emerging banana republic in which we have elected, it might be said, to live, or perhaps not elected to live. I tried to write my heart out about lying and corruption and demagogy. Remember, to elect is to choose. Election is choice. But here's George Eliot in Romola, decades before, more than a century before, doing all my work for me in a depiction of 15th century Florence, which I'll read you if I may. There was still one resource open to Tito. He might have turned back, sought Baldassare again, confessed everything to him, to Romola, to all the world, but he never thought of that. The repentance which cuts off all moorings to evil demands something more than selfish fear. He had no sense that there was strength and safety in truth. The only strength he trusted to lay in his ingenuity and his dissimulation. Now that the first shock, which had called up the traitorous signs of fear, was well past, he hoped to be prepared for all emergencies by cool deceit and by defensive armor. He had simply chosen to make life easy to himself, to carry his human lot, if possible, in such a way that it should pinch him nowhere. And the choice had at various times landed him in unexpected positions. The question now was not whether he should divide the common pressure of destiny with his suffering fellow man. It was whether all the resources of lying would save him from being crushed by the consequences of that habitual choice. I've been attacked in the collection that I've assembled on these questions for not including enough women authors or writers. I therefore feel, without necessarily accepting the lash of that criticism, that I think now, as I've always thought, that George Eliot is the gold standard in these matters and will do duty for any number of the men who I've written about at greater length. Partly that is to say, because as I hope I've just proved to you, she speaks for herself. Now, I don't know what the vote would be if I asked for an extra minute or two, but I'll try and attempt a conclusion. And I should try and make it prescriptive, I think, and say what I think might be the... What if I've said is true might be the consequence of it? Where would it take you? What are the opportunities? What are the occasions in which, if you think about it in this manner, one might proceed as a writer? What are the opportunities, in other words, for the latent political or public intelligence of literature? Well, the first one, I suggest, is this. We must now begin to find a language that can match the new world. Actually, it would be better to say the new cosmos that's been created for us. No, I should better say revealed to us, though neither creation nor revelation are words that one should use carelessly. Disclosed to us by the Hubble telescope and the translation of DNA. We live now at the very opening of a time where the nature of humanity and the nature of the universe can at last be scrutinized and understood without racism, without tribalism, without creationism, and without superstition. We occupy a position of privilege none of our ancestors could have guessed at. One page of Stephen Hawking on the event horizon or the black hole is far more awe-inspiring, infinitely more awe-inspiring than any babble about the burning bush in Genesis or Ezekiel or any babble about Armageddon. But we still employ the stilted, faltering metaphors of our prehistory. We're still stuck with the idiom we inherited, translating vivid new discourses back into the safe, solipsistic, burbling, comforting patois that we already know. Welcoming the completion of the Human Genome Project in the spring of last year, President Clinton sounded like a gaping Elmer Gantry when he said, "It gave us the dictionary our maker had used to create us." At the present, then, our language lags behind reality, behind science, behind discovery, and behind, I should stress this, behind humanity. That's the first task, to close that gap, to redress that extraordinary lag. And I have finally, and here's my wish list, and I'll make it quick, a wish for each of my adopted countries. I'm from the United Kingdom. I live and have lived for most of what could be called my adult life in the United States. In the post-UK Britain, the post-monarchical Britain, post-insular Britain, which already has the lineaments of a secular republic, or maybe a federation of secular Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and English republics. These lineaments are emerging within the carapace of the ancien regime, and we're going to require something transcendent to replace the exhausted symbolism of our antiquity. People, after all, do need something grand, something of grandeur and majesty. They don't live on republicanism alone. My own proposal is that Westminster Abbey be realigned, deposing the boneyard of royalism from the centerpiece, and renaming the condescendingly titled Poets' Corner. Only, I think, in England could a part of an abbey that contains so many people be so roped off with the touristic sign, Poets' Corner. Nothing could be more twee or condescending. In Oliver Cromwell's memorial cortege, Oliver Cromwell cut off King Charles's head and threatened to execute anyone who wouldn't sign the death warrant. He was really serious about getting rid of the profanity and absurdity of hereditary kingship. In Oliver Cromwell's memorial cortege, there walked John Milton, John Dryden, and Andrew Marvell. No monarch in English history has ever been followed to the grave by anything like a literary retinue of that splendor. Whereas the Queen Mother, our present Queen Mother, when she was introduced to that devoted royalist from St. Louis, Missouri, T.S. Eliot, could afterwards in an interview recall neither his name nor the title of the poem. She rather had the feeling it was called The Desert, that he'd been reading in Windsor Castle. But there is, in spite of all that, a great occluded Republican tradition in English literature, our shared writing. I call it English, though it partakes of great Scottish writers like Robert Burns, of course, and innumerable Irish writers, and Byron, and many others are exemplars of it. And it's time to make this Republican and popular and vigorous tradition explicit, and to teach it to the children, and yes, if you absolutely insist, to show it to the tourists too. Finally, and in the case of the United States, I think that it's time we found, or looked for, or one of us tries to become the writer who would strain every nerve, every creative energy, to cleanse this society of the filthy, the obscene influence of human sacrifice, by which I mean the almost now daily immolation by capital punishment of symbolic victims for the appeasement either of authority or populism. If it isn't normal to you, and you look at this society from the outside and see that it appears to require human sacrifice, every day or so, the full grotesquerie of it may not strike you. But I think it's also possible to live here, and I'm encouraged to find that there are many who agree with me, and to find it quite literally intolerable that the practice of human sacrifice still goes on in these United States. Some people say to me, well, other priorities may seem larger, have larger claims. But I think that there's probably no single change that could be made that will cumulatively amount to more than this one. Abolition, which I think would be the right name for it, abolitionist being the noblest word in the American vernacular, abolition would repudiate the heritage of racial bigotry and mob justice, while simultaneously limiting the overmighty state, or what some people call, rather too casually, big government. Every argument of law, every argument of decency, every argument of precedent has already been quite skillfully made against the gallows, against the gas chamber, against the firing squad, against the electric chair, which burns people alive in this, our time and century, and arguably most horrible of all, the pseudo-medicalized, banalized procedure of lethal injection, which degrades the medical profession and the ethics and practices of same, and all in our name. But for all the indignation and disgust that can be summoned against these spectacles, there is as yet no Blake, no Camus, no Koestler to synthesize justice and reason with outrage, to compose the poem or the novel, as Herman Melville, for example, did in his novel White Jacket, which led to the needful moral legislation that was involved in the abolition of flogging. In the course of the past decade, I hardly bothered with any of the books that tried to tell me of the postmodern death of authorship, or the relativism or the collectivization of authorship or the novel. I thought this was a superficial and ephemeral style, and I thought it would be exhausted before it had begun. And I decided to spend my time instead in rereading and reading again, and then having another look at the writers who've allowed me to phrase what I've just phrased for you. And I'm grateful to you, ladies and gentlemen, in the form of this very imperfect critique and appreciation. I just hope that with some effort, we might begin to transcend the pessimistic definition of poetry, which describes it as the element that's lost in translation. Thank you.
Christopher Hitchens has agreed to take some questions.
Agreed.
And
why not say consented?
He promised. He said he would be our hostage. I don't think we need to go that far. If you would actually step up to the mic to address your question, please do so that we can all hear the question.
Oh, my God. That can't be right.
Come on up. And while we're waiting for other people to come up to the mic, let me just ask a question. Since you're a journalist as well, can nonfiction have the impact? Can journalism do what poetry does?
Well, journalism can try. There's a famous example, actually, which is that of Upton Sinclair, who wrote a celebrated novel called The Jungle, about life and times in Chicago, and the exploitation and misery of immigrant workers, and the whole making of this terrible slaughterhouse, stockyard city. Great American drama. He was commissioned to write the novel as a journalistic series. He was given a small advance by the socialist paper in the Midwest called The Appeal to Reason, and sent off to Chicago and told, write it as a serial. Dickens used to write his novels as serials for newspapers. Others, Zola sometimes did the same. Go and do that. So he did, and the paper published it in that form. But what Sinclair wanted to do was to show to people what appalling conditions the workers toiled in Chicago. Guys were brought over from Latvia, Lithuania, hardly spoke any English, were more or less indentured to labor, worked in freezing or boiling conditions, up to their necks in blood and guts and so on, and were, in every possible sense of the word, exploited and misused. His description of it was so graphic. The book was an immediate success, except that those reading it thought, I don't know who these Latvian workers are, but is this how our meat that we eat is actually produced? It sounds yucky. And what it led to was a huge revolt in favor of the consumer, and the worker be damned, as it were. And musing on it later, Upton Sinclair said, well, I had aimed for the public's heart and the public's brain, but I hit it in the stomach. So he made an early discovery that this is a consumer society. And, well, these are not the only ironies of literary production, but they're the sort of thing that can happen with journalism, I think, or with the journalized version of literature. In other words, it can lead people simply to think in terms of clean government or moral improvement or better education, rather than to think, as I hope they would, more transcendently.
Just following up on that question, you admire George Orwell, and I do too. I think his appreciation for the word and the power of the word. And do you consider him to have been a journalist? He was truly based in the discovery of facts about things like the Spanish Civil War and other elements of history, and he wrote as a journalist, and I wondered if you would put him in that category.
Well, he certainly wouldn't have disowned the name of journalist, and was a proud member of the National Union of Journalists, and once described himself as smothered under journalism and unable to write what he hoped to write, which was a 4-volume novel sequence of which we only have the notes or the ambitious letters to agents and publishers. We don't quite even know what his intention was with this novel sequence. But we know that poverty and ill health, he died at the age of 48, inhibited him from realizing that ambition. But while he was paying the rent, in the meanwhile, he produced an extraordinary number of book reviews, small feuilletons, as you might call them, occasional pieces, conversational articles, on everything from how to make a proper English cup of tea, on which actually the best essay ever written on how to make a proper cup of tea, which I wish could be posted in every Greek coffee shop in the United States, and on why it was that, strange though it might seem, one solitary militiaman who happened to be in the right place at the right time in Barcelona in May of 1937 knew more and had found out more from that experience than the whole propaganda machinery of both sides in the Civil War, and was prepared to witness to it and go on witnessing to it until many years after his death he was proved right. That's a bit more than journalism, I guess. But well, I'm defining it a bit down, but I'm also, I haven't yet got to your excellent opening point about the importance of language. It's very easy, I sometimes think that concealed within the keyboard of laptops, there is a store of cliche. If you just touch it with your fingers, it'll go up your arms, into your brain, and down the arms again, and straight onto the page. And you'll find you've written something like, oh, God. Well, Orwell noticed things like people saying the jackboot has been thrown into the melting pot, for example. Or another thing he noticed in a paper was the fascist octopus has sung its swan song. You know, people who've been so propagandized, they're just banging out slogans. But And because this stuff is so hard to parody, I can't immediately think of a good example. But look, if you read certain book reviewers, you know, suppose you're coming to the end of a page in a column and you know you're going to turn the page and the book reviewer is saying, for this author to have visited Tibet, milked a yak, swum the Zambezi, written a sonnet sequence and whatever, fathered a child, so on, is, you've got to the bottom of the page, turn over, is it going to say no mean achievement? I think so. I think it's going to say no mean achievement. 9 times out of 10 it will. So don't write like that, okay? That wasn't written by the author at all. It was written by some horrible synthesis of the machine and the tired brain. Now, Orwell practically never did that. It's very remarkable how few lazy, slothful phrases are in his work. And he had to do a lot of hack work too. And in his big quarrel with Auden, which I could spend all night talking about, where he reproached Auden for using some lazy phrases that suggested euphemism about political killing, which Auden took very seriously, and amended the poem, in fact. You can see the moral power of simply insisting that language must bear some relationship to truth and to logic.
I have a small petty question and then a
Listen, I shouldn't be the one to recognize questioners because I could have planted anyone here and I don't know whether she'd finished or not.
They wanted the
Would you be
microphone.
the one to point, because I'd feel it might be suspect if I... All right,
Okay.
first to the mic wins.
Okay. The small petty question has to do with political poets who will survive.
Yes.
And I wonder if Brecht counts there. The larger question, in the defense of poetry, Shelley identifies poetry as a kind of enlivening spirit in science, philosophy, in other words, in all kinds of other things besides what we call poetry. And I wonder if you would recognize that spirit at work in other creative media now. Are there filmmakers, photographers who invent the poetic means by which we can make the changes? And finally, would your use of the phrase war crimes count as a poetic invention leading the way that jurists and lawyers will now need to follow?
Okay, well, with Bertolt Brecht, I'm afraid that it's partly his own fault, but even his best stuff will always come with some kind of a warning label, because partly he thought it was a matter of survival, I'm sure, but he made a pact with power, with ideology at the time, in order to stay not just healthy. He didn't have to do it to save his life or to save the life of his friends. He did it partly because he agreed with it. And one of his best-known poems, as a result, will always be the one where he finally appeared to see what he'd done, which was in 1953, when there was a rebellion in East Berlin where he'd gone as a post-McCarthy literary refugee. And the Communist Party and the Soviet Union put down the rebellion, and later distributed a leaflet on the Stalin Alley, which was the name then of the main drag in East Berlin, saying that the workers had lost the confidence of the Communist Party and would have to toil quite a long time before they won this confidence back. And Brecht at that point wrote, but did not then publish, a short poem that said, wouldn't it be easier for the party to dissolve the people and elect a new one? And that's probably his best-known line of verse, in fact. But it's not remembered just for its aptness, but because it appears to show that towards the end he had a realization, an ironic one at any rate, of how he had been, as the French say, a valet du pouvoir. If there are moral equivalents of this being attempted even in cinema or photography, I don't know what they are. I doubt it, as I doubt all stuff about the death of print, the death of the novel, the death of the magazine. So a friend of mine the other day was saying, supposing all newspapers and magazines have been online for years and years now, suppose that was the way they came to us, and books too. And someone said, listen, you know, let's just kick this idea around at the boardroom meeting. It's a wild one. I'm out of left field here, but what if we printed some of these, downloaded them, so people could carry them around with them, and you know, could take them on the subway or read them on the can, or you know, in the bars. And what do you think? Do you think that would fly? What do you think? I know I'm, you know, just crazy here. I wish that discussion would go on. I rejoice every time the nonsense about the absolute uniqueness, singularity, necessity, imperative need for print and for solitary composition and contemplation is negated. I see these predictions. I just wait for them to falsify themselves. I'm totally unimpressed by all of it, just as I'm unimpressed by all forms of relativism, all of those who say you can't really verify anything. Nothing ever really happened. You can't prove anything. I don't believe it. Okay, I think I can disprove it, which would take me to your last point. By saying war criminal about Henry Kissinger, a man I once swore I would never read again unless he published some prison diaries. I don't mean anything metaphorical or propagandistic at all. I mean to say that international law and customary law has been evolving slowly over the last 10 years and unnoticed by many people, but observably, however unevenly, in one direction, which is to the abolition of the concept of sovereign immunity, the old medieval fallacy that crimes committed under color of government or state power aren't crimes, as they would be if you or I committed them. When the British bobbies went round and disconnected Mr. Pinochet's telephone in his clinic and said, "Sorry, mate, you're nicked. You're under arrest. We gotcha. You know, and you can't leave." And he said, "I want Mrs. Thatcher on the phone right away." So you call her if you like. It have to be from a pay phone. Since that happened, and since the demand from Slobodan Milosevic's arrest was made, the warrant was issued while he was still president of Serbia. Sovereign immunity is over. We finally completed what used to be called the bourgeois revolution, where not even the feudal lord is above the law. Took a long time, but it has happened. Since the United States is the only power that really can make this kind of thing stick, and since it's also the power that encloses within its borders, I would say upwards of 10,000 overfed and contented and complacent human rights organizations with large budgets to give themselves award dinners and hire lawyers to investigate obscure cases and honorable and deserving cases, I should add, as far away as Burma and Bolivia. The crucial test is about to devolve upon the American people and their Senate and Congress. Will they shelter the most outstanding single war criminal in the world within their own borders, continue to shower him with honors, attention, and sycophancy, even though he has spat in their face, broken their laws, falsified their own historical record, stolen the documents that would allow us to scrutinize it, and made the name of the United States deservedly stink in mass graves stretching from one end of the terrestrial globe to the other. My wager is that they won't say that they'll live with that, but if they do, the consequences are just as grave. It means they must simply drop the habit of lecturing other people about war crimes and crimes of state. So the stakes are very high, but so they should be. And I might add, I think it will happen. I actually do think that the hubris will be punished. I think that before very long you will read, you might have to dig into the B section or so on of the New York Times to do it, but it will happen that a legal tentacle from what he did in Chile will extend back to him. His presence will be required at a hearing in Santiago, or a suit will be brought against him in America for the murders that he committed, commissioned, paid for, armed, suborned, organized, and covered up in that country. I believe that will actually happen. And on that day, I think many other people too will make a little holiday in our hearts. It's time. It really is time.
Christopher Hitchens is a columnist for Vanity Fair and The Nation. His latest book is titled Unacknowledged Legislation, Writers in the Public Sphere. It's published by Verso Books. For more information, visit their website at verso.com.